Treat them like dogs, and you'll have dogs' works and dogs' actions. Treat them like men, and you'll have men's works, is a quote from Harriet Beecher Stowe, an abolitionist who is best known for her literary writings. Beginning her education at just 8 years old, Stowe spent most of her life learning new information and later pursued teaching as a career. Stowe was blessed with an amazing education, which she later used to bring light to the mistreatment of enslaved African Americans. Harriet Beecher Stowe raised awareness to the injustices of slavery by writing the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, speaking out against inequality, and influencing those around her to become activists. Harriet Beecher Stowe was born on June 14, 1811, in Litchfield, Connecticut, to parents Reverend Lyman Beecher and Roxana Foote. She was the sixth out of 11 children, but when she was 5, her mother died, leaving her eldest sister Catherine as the mother figure in the house. Stowe's father later remarried. However, she still looked up to Catherine in terms of her education and further responsibility. Stowe loved to debate, so she would talk constantly at the dinner table about current events and social issues. Through these dinner talks, she learned how to argue very well. She started her formal education at Sarah Pierce's Academy, where she was encouraged to study academic and ornamental art subjects. In 1824, she enrolled at Hartford Seminary, where she spent hours each day composing essays. Stowe later became a teacher at the institution. In 1832, Harriet Beecher Stowe moved with her family to Cincinnati, where her father was appointed president of Lane Theological Seminary. Around this time is when she met her husband, Calvin Stowe, a theology professor. The two had 7 children together. However, in the summer of 1849, her 18-month-old son, Samuel Charles, died of cholera. This experience later served as inspiration for Uncle Tom's Cabin because she could better understand the pain that enslaved mothers felt after their children were sold from them. Several years later, in 1850, her husband began working at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, which caused the family to move there until 1853. After the Civil War, the family purchased a house in Florida where Stowe's brother Charles opened a school to teach emancipated people. Harriet Beecher Stowe's experiences in family, education, and marriage life all influenced her literary works. Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, brought attention to the reality of slavery. The process for writing the novel began in 1851 when national publisher Gamaliel Bailey asked Stowe to write a story that would paint a word picture of slavery. Bailey also informed Stowe that this piece would be run in the abolitionist newspaper. Initially, Stowe planned to write a book with only 3 or 4 chapters. However, the final product ended up being more than 40. The actual plot of the story involves 2 slaves who are sold to a plantation to pay off debts. They both eventually run away and are later reunited, but in the end, only one survives. By selling the book, Stowe had financial security, which allowed her to write full-time. In 1853, the book was published as a 2-volume book and sold more than 10,000 copies in the United States in just 1 week. 300,000 copies were sold in the first year, and in Great Britain, 1.5 million copies were sold. Since Connecticut was the last New England state to abolish slavery, it is very possible that Harriet could have been exposed to slavery. She talks about how her earliest memories were of indentured servants, which likely influenced the focus of the book. To learn about slavery, Stowe traveled to Kentucky, where slavery was legal, to visit plantations. Through this experience, she also learned that even the talk of slavery could divide one's community. To paint an accurate picture for the book, she asked her friends to send her information on first-hand accounts of slaveries they had experienced. The novel talks about slave hunters who were hired to recapture escaped slaves, as well as sex slaves who were forced to obey extreme demands and were severely beat and whipped. Stowe writes in the book, "I didn't give it for one. Nay, I'll say, besides, that ours is the more bold and palpable infringement of human rights, actually buying up a man like a horse, looking at his teeth, cracking his joints, and trying his paces, and then paying down for him. Having speculators, breeders, traders, and brokers in human bodies and souls, sets the thing before the eyes of the civilized world in a more tangible form. Though the thing done be, after all, in its nature the same, that is, appropriating one set of human beings to the use and in the improvement of another, without any regard to their own." This quote shows the mistreatment of slaves in detail, which sparked America's attention and made her audience take action. Her honest depiction of slavery made Americans realize the evil occurring in their world. In the book, Stowe shares ideas about the injustice of slavery and denies cultural beliefs and capacities of Black people. Harriet Beecher Stowe used her platform as a way to bring awareness to slavery. Stowe toured internationally and donated many of her proceeds to anti-slavery causes. She also wrote on behalf of abolition. She wrote the appeal to women of the free states of America on the present crisis on our country. In this article, Beecher expressed how God gave women a deeper knowledge which they must use to guard not only their rights, but the rights of slaves. She focused on the role of women in the anti-slavery movement and closely related the life of a slave to one of a young white mother. She urges women to speak up and fulfill their duty. This idea of rallying women is seen when Stowe writes, "Women of America, we do not know with what thrilling earnestness the hopes and the eyes of the world are fastened on our country, and with what intenseness they desire that we should take decided ground for universal liberty." The article also helped raise outcry to defeat the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act allowed people in Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. Once passed on May 30th, 1854, violence quickly arose and eventually led to the anti-slavery forces, such led by John Brown, to get physical with their opinions. Harriet Beecher Stowe's writing in this article gave a voice to women of her time and influenced them to help fight against slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe influenced generations to take part in activism. The environment in which her children were raised in encouraged them to take part in worldly affairs. All of her children became educators, and all of her boys became clergymen. One child, Henry, spoke out often about abolition and advocated for temperance. Her sister's daughter, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, became an author and advocate of women's rights and social reform. Stowe's other sisters, Catherine and Isabella, made just as big an impact on the world as Harriet did. Catherine became an advocate for women's education and established schools for girls in Connecticut, Ohio, Iowa, and Wisconsin. Isabella became a driving force in the women's suffrage movement. She organized the annual convention of the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1871. With the help of her husband, Isabella introduced a bill to Connecticut legislature which gave married women the same property rights as their husbands. Harriet Beecher Stowe had such a powerful voice and energy that others saw in her and admired. She raised her children to become powerful young women and men, and her fiery spirit is seen in the activism of her sisters as well. Harriet Beecher Stowe was only halfway through her life when she published Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she continued to work and write to improve society. From Brunswick, she moved to Andover, Massachusetts, where her husband became a professor of theology at Andover Theological Seminary. After she retired, she then moved back to Hartford, Connecticut. Here she built her dream house and Nook Farm. She also went on 2 speaking tours, one along the East Coast, the second taking her to the Western states. Her purpose here was to reinvigorate the art museum at the Wadsworth Atheneum and establish the Hartford Art School, both of which were established. In Hartford, she also wrote The American Woman's Home, Lady Byron Vindicated, and Pygonac People. Then in 1873, Stowe moved to a cottage on Forest Street and stayed there for 23 years. Stowe held talks called Salons at Stowe, which discussed race, class, and gender. They talked about modern issues while still relating to those of the 19th century. Today, a Stowe Prize is awarded to an adult fiction or nonfiction book which focuses on a social justice issue in the United States. The work must be written and published in the U.S. and must prioritize issues of race and gender. The prize comes with a $10,000 award and the amount of $1,000 and $2,500 to high school and college students. Stowe's spirit lives on through the hundreds of anti-slavery organizations which followed her. Millions of people in America recognize the name Harriet Beecher Stowe and can identify her by the influential works she accomplished.